How did you get along with Gary Owen otherwise?
You know, I think quite well. Interestingly, because of some of the policy work we did, I think we had an uneasy respect for each other. We had very different styles. And ultimately, after he left the legislature, friendship may be strong, but you know, we've had a very good relationship. Probably my most difficult relationship with another leader was when we were feeling like we were getting closer to majority, and that was Lou Dodak. And it didn't help that the Republicans targeted Lou and ultimately defeated him in the year we gained half control.
Well, it helped when he wasn't there anymore.
Yeah, I think shared power would have been more difficult had
with him.
Lou won re-election.
Than with Curtis Hertel.
Yeah, and actually Lou, when this started with muzzling, but Lou exercised his power when we very aggressively in the early 90s, when John Engler was having to cut budgets, we were all having to sacrifice. We went after the House budget, and that upset Lou. And he said, okay, you want to streamline the House budget? We're going to do away with the minority print shop and do all the printing through the majority print shop. And it resulted in the layoff of a number of our employees and really did not help relations between the two parties going into the 1992 election.
Yeah, looking even farther back to your first 4 years, Bobby Krim was the speaker, right?
Yes.
Until 1982. What was your impression of Bobby Krim compared to, let's say, Gary Owen and Lou Dodak?
Bobby was somewhere between Bill Ryan and Gary Owen in his style. I mean, he could be a very tough speaker, but he did, with Bill Ryan's, I think, mentorship, cared a lot about policy, and it was interesting because at times he would be bad cop and really go after Bill Milliken, but in the end, he would work out things with Bill Milliken and the Republicans.
Well, now, Bill Ryan was still in the House, right?
Yes, he chaired the tax committee.
Yeah, but he'd given up being speaker. He was speaker before Bobby Krim. So you actually probably got to know Bill Ryan. So what was your impression of him?
I loved Bill Ryan. He was totally committed to the institution. While I disagreed with him on policy more often than that, you always knew that he believed in what he was championing in the way of policy. It wasn't Bill Ryan reading a political poll. Right. He cared deeply about policy. Yeah. And I served on his committee when he chaired the tax committee, and I was privileged to actually serve under Bill Ryan and Lynn Johndal, both great legislators, far more liberal than I, but very focused on what they thought was the best policy for the state. And they did want to hear the minority's viewpoint. We didn't usually win our arguments, but we had the chance to speak and negotiate. Were
fair-minded.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, so it's 1991, 92. You've got a House that I think is like 61 Democrats, 49 Republicans, something like that. Along comes the 92 election. You guys pick up 6 seats and you tie. Huzzah! For the first time in 24 years, you've got shared power, 55-55 tie with the Democrats. And this provoked a session that really was pretty historic in many ways. And you became co-speaker. Can you go into that and explain how that all worked out?
Yeah, well, it's, first of all, it wasn't clear how we were going to resolve this problem.
A lot of people thought it's just not going to work.
Yeah, Pat Gagliardi was the floor leader under Lou Dodak, and he came up with a great idea of passing a resolution in the lame duck session of 92, which said that if we couldn't resolve how to share power, whoever controlled in the prior session would control in the new session.
Yeah, I'd say that was a pretty good deal for his side,
But when the lawyers went to work, it was decided not to pursue that. Meanwhile, I was out talking with prospects on the Democratic side whom I thought might vote for a Republican speaker. And it wasn't until December when Dennis Muchmore, now Chief of Staff for Governor Snyder, and then lobbyist, came to me and went to Curtis Hertel separately and said, you know, you guys don't know each other all that well. You haven't served on the same committees, but I think you would like each other. So I'm going to set up a time when you can meet in a bar in Holt just to get to know each other. And
the Democrats had already elected Hertel to be
yes.
their leader to succeed Dodak, who had been defeated.
Right.
Okay, so you meet at a bar in Holt?
Bar and we got to know each other. It was probably a 2-hour visit, and decided that we really did need to try and figure out how to share power if we could. And that resulted in intense work in late December, early January, to put together rules that would decide how we would share power. And we did a lot of, on our side, did a lot of research. Indiana had been in a similar situation. They had decided to alternate the presiding over session every other day, which was a fiasco. The Democrats, Curtis, suggested that we flip a coin and whoever won the toss would preside in the first year, and the other side would preside in year 2. And we were very fearful we'd lose the coin toss and never see majority. So we came up, really Rick Banstra, who was our floor leader at the time, came up with the idea, let's alternate every other month on the floor. And when we presided on the floor in that month, the other party, the Democrats, would preside in the committees. So basically you'd have a 2-month cycle. You would preside 1 month in committee, run your bills, and then have a chance to run them on the floor. And it would be alternating 2-month cycles, essentially.
How about the speaker?
The speaker would be every other month.
Every other month.
So that's what we agreed to, and what initially we conceived would be, well, one side is going to run its agenda, first in committee and then on the floor, and then have to give up power for 2 months. So you'd have alternating agendas. Turned out to be, for the most part, a lot of cooperation. In the key committees, the committee chairs started to plan the agendas together, and no matter who is presiding, they quickly came to understand that no bills get out of committee if you don't have a bipartisan vote, because the committees were equally divided, just as the House floor was equally divided.
Right.
So a lot of bipartisanship resulted out of this crazy shared power agreement that most predicted would fall apart quickly. And I have to say, of the 18 years, those 2 years were the most fulfilling for me. It's when Proposal A ultimately became law, and we prepared the ballot proposal.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah, but we did some important work. That's
right. Well, let
important.
me ask you, what else happened during those 2 years you can think of in particular, other than Proposal A? Because we'll get to that in a second.
Well, first of all, institutionally, we got away from the model that whoever controls essentially has political patronage to load up the clerk's office and the business offices, and decided that we would essentially have nonpartisan staffs. And so a lot of Democrats from the previous 24 years did stay on, but we appointed some Republicans as well. And I honestly don't know how that nonpartisan model has been sustained in practice, but I think it was a good model going into a term-limited legislature, because at the same time we ended up with shared power in '92, that's when term limits were enacted. Right. So we did need to change the institutional model a bit to prepare for term limits. That was one accomplishment. As I recall, we did some essential insurance law changes. We passed medical malpractice reform. A lot of our focus was on school finance and the school aid formula, the whole Proposal A debate. When we did control, in the second year for a short time because of a death in the Democratic caucus. We did run strikes, teacher strike penalties, which was very controversial, and some campaign finance reform.
Right.
But for me, when I think of those 2 years, the landmark was what was the culmination of a 20-year tried and failed effort to change how we finance schools.
Yeah. Well, before we get to that again, one more question. The Senate. Wasn't Dick Posthumus the Senate Majority Leader at that time?
Yes.
How were you working with the Senate as an institution? I mean, they're probably sitting over there saying, what is this?
Yes.
You know, shared power in the House? How do we deal with this?
Well, that showed up in the in Proposal A more than any other issue. But I think they had to accommodate us. For example, we had to change how we did conference committees between the House and Senate.
Right.
We had, as I recall, 2 members from each caucus on a conference committee, and we needed to have a 3-to-1 vote of a divided House side of a conference committee.
I see. Okay.
So that was frustrating at times.
Even that had to be cooperation, or whatever.
On the other, and the other thing is, we really did insist, for the first time having at least shared power, that some of the rules that were convenient to the Senate majority with the House Democratic majority had to be followed more closely. So one issue I remember is that we really insisted that only points of difference be negotiated in conference.
Very important thing. That's actually what a conference committee is supposed to be about.
It was supposed to be about.
Rather than rewriting the whole bill.
The majorities, the Democratic majority in the House over the years, and then the Senate Republican majority had gotten into the habit of going beyond the bounds of what had been passed in the 2 versions of the bill.
Right. Well, okay, let's get to Proposal A. Now, that happened really on the floor of the Senate. That's where it began, when Debbie Stabenow stood up and offered an amendment wiping out property taxes as a basis for financing K-12 public education in Michigan. What is your memory of that when you heard about it in the House, and your understanding of what happened in the Senate? Dick Posthumus is the leader, Engler is the governor, and then of course it passes and it comes over to the House.
Yeah.
And you guys, I'm not going to tell the story for you, but you passed it too, went to Engler, he signed it. You had 4 or 5 months to figure out how we're going to fund our schools. And that was the big achievement that you'll always be remembered for, Proposal A.
Yeah. Well, first of all, a little context. I firmly believe that Jim Blanchard's undoing was the property tax issue. To the point where he had in 1989 a special election to try and pass a half-cent sales tax increase to fund education but not address property tax. And that divided the Democrats. We actually put an alternative bipartisan proposal together and put it on the ballot with a 2/3 vote.
2 of them were on at once.
Yeah.
And they both
went down.
Yeah.
And that allowed John Engler to talk about the nickel of property tax relief. But John championed school finance reform in a special election in '93, which also went down.
Very narrowly.
Very narrowly, but
actually carried 80 counties.
Yes,
I think it only lost in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb. Narrowly lost.
But I think John was very concerned about the impact on his next election.
Exactly.
So the Republicans in a shared powerhouse, and the Republicans in the Senate had very different ideas about how to address this issue after the defeat of the Engler special election proposal.